would like to see Idahoans keep their tax dollars and less growth in the government budget overall. So that's what we're fighting for. We have a freedom and family agenda. Talks about let's have universal school choice. Let's repeal the grocery tax. Let's get DEI out of higher education and indeed out of all of government. Let's have sound immigration reform. Sound money policies, transactional gold, for example. And let's get budgets under control. 54% growth over the last 5 years is outrageous. And to pile 16.9% on top of that is outrageouser, if that's even a word. And so we need to get spending under control and spend responsibly. We need to have government accountability and transparency. Are you aware of the fraud that has happened in Bannock County, in Pocatello, and in child care grant programs? Senator Glenita Zeiderveld is on top of all of that stuff. She's become the master whistleblower for government waste, fraud, and abuse. And of course, we'll continue with legislator accountability. Our Idaho Freedom Index and our Idaho Spending Index are the gold standard for you to know how your legislators actually vote versus what they say they do. So you can get a copy of the Idaho Freedom Index. We might have some back there. You can always come by our offices and grab one. We also produced the Idaho Pork Report this past year, outlining, we have 44 pages here of examples where government has been, in our estimation, misspending your money. Did you know that Coeur d'Alene hired a poet on the taxpayer dime? Do we need a state poet? Forget I said that. We don't want to give them ideas. So I'll finish up here by giving you, this isn't about me today. It's about Nicholas Kleinworth telling you about how to be engaged in the legislature with Legislature 101. And it's about Dorothy Moon talking about the GOP legislative agenda. So I just want to finish with a quote here by Bastiat and a message for where we're going. Bastiat says, "Government is the great fiction through which everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everybody else." Now, stealing from you would be a crime. Stealing from you through the power or the levers of government is equally offensive to me. And so Idaho Freedom Foundation exists here to protect your rights. Each of us has natural rights from God. Therefore, we each have the moral authority to act as individuals to protect those and defend those rights. Among those rights are life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. And the IFF, the Idaho Freedom Foundation, exists to help in every way possible Idahoans in those protections. I'll offer you Nicholas Kleinworth to see how you can get involved and engaged in the legislative process and work hand in hand with the IFF to protect those individual rights. Thank you for coming here today, and we invite you to come here every Thursday for Capital Clarity. Thank you. I do need to say one more thing I almost forgot. Dorothy Moon is here as the chairman of the GOP, but she is also a founding member of Capital Clarity. Before Idaho Freedom Foundation was even involved in this, she and Janice McGeehan decided to start this Thursday thing to help engage citizens. So it's great to have her here for our 2025 inauguration event for us. Thank you. I'll give it to you.
How am I supposed to follow up with that? Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. So how much do you know about your state government? Each of you probably asked this question as you were considering whether or not to come to Capital Clarity today and whether or not it would be a valuable use of your time to come to Legislature 101. So thank you all for coming here and spending your afternoon with us to learn about how your state government functions. But with so much attention focused on Washington, D.C., what happens in the states has often become an afterthought. We focus on the presidency, but a lot of people don't even know who their state senators are or who their local representatives are in the state house. And so this can be very dangerous to our republic and to this great nation that our founders established. In the Constitution of the United States, the 10th Amendment states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." Though I will concede that the sovereignty of our state has decreased considerably since its founding, you would still find that the most impactful policies are made right here in Boise. I would contend that the proof of this concept is all the people coming in from Washington, Oregon, and California. You see the effect of those bad policies over there and the gradient between those states and the gem state and how that influences people to move to Idaho for a better life. And so I'm the policy director for the Idaho Freedom Foundation. This is actually my 4th legislative session. And so I've had a lot of exposure to this process and a lot of time spent with the lawmakers, and it was a privilege to spend all that time with them, and an even greater privilege to have yet another session to spend with them. And so my goal with this presentation is to preserve our republic by making Idahoans more informed, equipped, and vigilant about what happens in the State House. Today we'll talk about the legislative process, how to read legislation, and how to testify in committee. So to start, we're going to start with the legislative process and look at how bills move through the State House. So this slide provides an overview of the legislative process and how a bill will move through the 2 sides of this building and ultimately to the governor's desk, and if it's a good bill, hopefully to the Idaho State Code. You see, it starts with bill drafting. It goes through a series of readings. On the first reading, it's mostly just an introductory, it's the introduction to the bill. It'll go through committees and testimony, then go through a second reading and a third reading where the legislature will ultimately cast their vote for that legislation. It repeats that process through both chambers. Then it's reviewed, gets the signatures from House and Senate leadership, sent to the governor's desk for his final action. So to start, we need to look at what a bill can actually do. A bill can either create or enact a new law, change or amend an existing law, eliminate or repeal an existing law, or set aside money for a particular purpose, or is known as an appropriation. Now, historically, executive agencies have contended that the appropriations are merely suggestions, as we saw with the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare recently. But I can assure you that an appropriation is just as much law as any other law that we have to follow. And so only those appropriations apply to the government. They don't like it as much when they have to follow those ones. And so who can introduce a bill? This changes depending on what time it is in the legislative session because we are a part-time legislature. We only have about 3 months and give or take a couple weeks to get all of our business done here in Idaho, or in Boise, Idaho. So we have to limit who can introduce bills at different points in the legislative session. All members can start introducing bills as of this last Monday, day 1. Members, groups of members, or committees can introduce bills. By day 12, this changes a bit. So only committees can introduce legislation. And this is different in the Senate, it's day 12. In the House, it's day 20. These are business days, so it doesn't count weekends. And then by day 36, only special committees can introduce legislation. So this includes the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, this includes the Education Committee, and such. So moving on to drafting a bill. The bill starts as an idea, of course, and lawmakers can get these ideas from a variety of different sources. It could either come from other states, it can come from you as the constituents, and then they take that idea and they draft it. And they go, okay, well, how is this going to look when it interacts with the Idaho State Code? They take it to the Legislative Services Office, they draft it for them, and it's given what's called a routing slip number, or an RS number. And this is just a way for us to track the bill. Now, you have to keep in mind that when the bill is in this stage, it's actually the property of the lawmaker themselves. So because it is their personal property, it's not publicly available. You can't see an RS unless a lawmaker chooses to share it with you or share it publicly. And so this kind of protects the lawmaker, especially as it's in its early drafting phase and they're working out the kinks in the legislation. But to move the bill through the legislative process, the very next step is to get a print hearing. They'll get permission from the chairman to present the bill before the committee, and the committee will vote as to whether or not they want to print the bill. And when they're printing the bill, they basically take that RS. If they vote to print it, it'll go to the secretary, and it is given a bill number. From there, it'll go to the first reading. So at this point, they've gone to the floor session, and the bill is read across the desk for the first time. So it's often read by only the number and committee title, the number, committee, and title only. The bill can be read in full, and the rule does say that the bill needs to be read in full, but it's often asked that they suspend the rule. So this can be done by what's called unanimous consent. A lawmaker can stand up and ask for the rule to be suspended. But if one lawmaker objects to suspending the rule, then they have to read the bill in its entirety. I get a lot of questions as to why somebody would want to do that. It's really just for time's sake. Luckily in Idaho, we have what's called a single subject rule. So most legislation generally follows this rule, where only one topic can be contained in that piece of legislation. We don't have bills like what you see in Washington, D.C., where they're 5,000 pages long and they cover everything under the sun, just so that way everyone can get a cut of the money. In Idaho, you have one subject to consider, and the bills are generally less than about 5 pages. Occasionally, you'll get one that's about 50 pages. It's usually tax code. And so the suspending of the reading is really just to save time. So then after it's been read across the desk the first time, it's referred to a committee. The bill can be sent to, it's usually sent to a germane committee or a committee that is covering the topic that the bill is addressing. So if we're dealing with healthcare policy, it'll be sent to the Health and Welfare Committee of the respective chamber. And so that committee will hear the bill. They'll hear testimony for and against that bill. This is where you would come in and you would testify about your position on the bill, whether or not you think it should pass. And then the committee will vote on whether or not that legislation gets to move to the floor. Now, the committee can take several actions. They can vote to send it to the floor with a recommendation. They could either recommend that the bill passes, or they can send it to the floor with no recommendation. So that tends to be a situation where the committee considered a very contentious piece of legislation, and they didn't want to attach a recommendation to it. They wanted to send it to the full body for consideration and debate. And so they could also vote to kill the bill. They could say, no, we're not going to send it to the floor. We're going to hold it here in the committee. It's going to be dead right now. And so that would be if they failed to get a majority vote in the committee. And they could also vote to table the bill, which doesn't happen very often, but it will freeze the bill in that committee unless the committee decides that they would really like to hear that bill again. It effectively kills the bill because it only takes a simple majority to table the bill, but it takes a 2/3 majority on the committee to untable the bill and bring it back up for consideration. So there has to be quite the consensus to say, hey, we want to revisit this piece of legislation. And so you kind of see we are looking at an example piece of legislation. We're looking at Senate Bill 1046 from 2021. This is a minutes report from the committee. You can kind of see all the different parts of that process. You can see that the bill was being considered, Senate Bill 1046. It took testimony. We only had 2 people testifying on that bill. We had Representative Wendy Horman, along with Rob Mendlove and Andy Grover also testifying. And the secretary will just take a general position down as far as what you said about the bill, for and against. They'll document any discussion that the committee had, and then move on for a roll call vote. This bill ended up moving on to the floor for full consideration. So at that point, the bill is sent to the second reading calendar. And so at this point, the bill will just be read second time, possibly in full, but usually number, title, committee only. And people ask, well, why would you want to do a second reading? Well, the second reading is just to let lawmakers know that the next time you see this piece of legislation, it has successfully come out of committee and will be before the body for a full vote. And the next time you see it, you will be voting on it. And so it's to help lawmakers keep track of where this bill is in the process. So from there, it'll move on to the third reading calendar. This is the final time the legislature or each chamber will see that bill. So the bill is read in its entirety for the third time unless the rule is suspended. There will be debate. They can debate up to 60 minutes. Each member can debate up to 60 minutes total on a bill, and then they'll take a vote. If a simple majority is reached, the bill passes, and it'll repeat the process over in the other chamber, except for constitutional amendments, which require a 2/3 majority to pass. Like I said before, the bill will repeat the process over in the other chamber. You can see in our example legislation, this bill was amended. So it'll go to the other chamber. They may want to make some changes to that legislation. So this bill started in the Senate, went over to the House. House made some changes. And so now both chambers have to keep voting on that legislation until they agree on what those changes are. And so it can make its way through the process several times over. Okay. So final review and signatures. If this bill were to pass, both chambers, all amendments included, then it is returned to the chamber of origin and is what's called enrolled or finalized and prepared. All that means is everything is gathered together, all the information in the bill is bundled, and then it receives its signature from the Senate and House leadership. So that way it can go to the governor's desk. From there, the governor can do one of three things. He can either sign, veto, or do nothing. When you think about national politics, the president has what's called a pocket veto. So he can choose to not overtly veto the legislation, and the legislation would die without his signature. But here in the state of Idaho, it's actually the reverse. So if the governor decides that he doesn't want to sign the legislation, but he also doesn't veto the legislation and chooses to do nothing, that legislation will go into effect if it's sat on his desk for 10 days without any action. So there is a time limit there. It's actually why we still have grocery tax. The legislation to repeal the grocery tax actually passed both the House and the Senate, went to Governor Otter's desk, and he vetoed it late. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was a little ambiguous as to whether or not as to when that 10-day time window actually starts. And so they said, we'll give it to you this time, but in the future it starts at this time. And so now we still have a grocery tax fight on our hands. Okay. Please excuse me, the slide is correcting me. So it's not 10 days, it is 5 days. If he vetoes the bill, it's sent to the House where the bill originated. And that chamber will then vote on whether or not they would like to override the veto. It takes a 2/3 majority vote to override a veto, and it has to go through both chambers. So both the House and the Senate have to concur that they are overriding the veto of the governor, and then at that point, the legislation can become law. Apologies for the mistake earlier. But in this case, in the case of our example legislation, the governor did sign the piece of legislation. It looks like he received it that morning and then signed it the same day. So that legislation is now law. So now we're going to pivot a little bit to reading legislation. So now we know what the process is and what's ahead of us as we're moving through the State House. So first, I want to take you to the legislative website. So to access all the legislation that'll be coming before the legislature this session, you'll want to go to legislature.idaho.gov. And you'll want to click on that part that says legislative sessions, that box over there to the left at the top there. And that'll take you to this page. And you'll want to click on legislation by bill number if you happen to know the bill number of that particular legislation, but you can also auto sort the list using those other options that are quite handy. I generally use legislation by subject and topic because I look at a lot of budget specific bills and it'll sort those out for me. So then moving on, this is the list of legislation that you'll see. Right now there isn't very much on this page, but it'll continue to accrue legislation as the legislative session goes on. It updates pretty much in real time, actually. So as soon as you hear it read across the desk for the first reading, I could almost always go to this website and see that it's been posted, and I can read it almost immediately. And so I would say that the legislative services staff have actually done a pretty good job making sure that this is made publicly available as soon as possible. The example legislation that we're looking at here is actually House Bill 77 from the 2021 legislative session. And we see that this provides us with a bunch of information on the bill. So you can kind of see where it is in the legislative process, what committee it's currently going through. So in this particular example, it's going through the Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee. And then it's only been referred to the committee. It hasn't moved through the legislative process yet. You can see that it's kind of stalled right there. And if we want a little more information about what the bill actually does, you can click Bill Text, which will be our next slide here. So reading the legislation, you see there in the header, it'll tell you which legislative session we're considering this bill. So you have your date, and this bill was considered in the 66th legislature. You could see which chamber it originated in. So this originated in the House of Representatives. You have your bill number. And then we'll move on to the body text of this legislation. So when you're reading legislation, the text that is not formatted, so it has no underlining, it has no strike-throughs or anything like that, that's existing Idaho code, unless I'll get to where that could be different later. But for now, that's just existing Idaho code, no changes. They're adding text in the instances where it is all underlined. So all that underlined right there is new language to the Idaho code. And then you'll look above look closer to the top of that paragraph A there. We have some language that's been struck out. Of course, that means that that language will no longer exist in Idaho code should this legislation pass. Okay, so briefly I want to turn to statement of purposes and fiscal notes. You can see that's right under the bill text link. So with a statement of purpose and a fiscal note, there is one caveat. This wasn't prepared by a neutral third party of any sort. This was prepared by the bill sponsor themselves when they submitted the legislation to the Legislative Services Office. So it's less of a neutral third party analysis of how this legislation is designed to function and more of their sales pitch for the legislation. So read it with that kind of a background to understand where the author is coming from. In this case, you can see that this legislation was actually written by our president, our now president, then Representative Ron Nate. And then also you'll see that there's a helpful note called the fiscal note. The fiscal note is also not done by any economists or people who are experienced with numbers in every respect. It's prepared by the bill sponsor, and it may or may not be accurate depending on what they would like to divulge about the bill's impact. But for the most part, it has to be accurate. A committee can challenge a piece of legislation if it's pretty obvious that the fiscal note is not accurate, and that person on the committee that's levying the challenge against the bill sponsor is able to demonstrate why the fiscal note is inaccurate. And so at that point, they would have to redraft the bill with a new fiscal note. And so that serves as a check on the system. I've seen some pretty bad fiscal notes that seemed to pass muster. My favorite one is that they just simply stated there will be an impact on the general fund. No positive or negative or anything like that. There will be an impact. That's less than helpful, of course, but more often than not, it'll provide the exact dollar amounts and which funds are coming to that to fund that legislation. Okay, so repealing sections of code. So keep in mind, we could repeal sections of code like this, or we could have a heading that just says this section is hereby repealed. So make sure that when you're reading legislation that you have an eye out for a new section that says that something is repealed. It may not always stand out as language that's been struck out from the bill. Similarly, you can add entirely new sections without having to do the underlining. That's also with a similar heading where it says that they are adding a new section to that part of Idaho code, and then everything that follows is brand new to Idaho code. Okay, and before I move on to testify in committee, I just want to make one note. A lot of bills have what's called emergency clauses at the end. Now, a lot of people post-COVID were very upset about these emergency clauses because they thought that we were perpetuating the COVID emergency and that we were enabling emergency powers for the government to exercise over us. But really what this legislation is doing when it has an emergency clause is it means that it needs to go into effect before January 1st. And so a lot of legislation is based on the fiscal year, and so you would need to have an emergency clause in there that says this legislation will go into effect July 1st instead of January 1st. So, but in instances where tax policy is applicable, you want that to start at the beginning of the tax year, which would be January 1st. So keep that in mind. Okay, so moving on to testifying in committee. Just have a few points there, but let me start with how to sign up. So when you are signing up to testify in a committee, make sure that you go to the agenda on the website, and there's usually a link at the top of that agenda. You can click that agenda, and you can fill out the web form, and they'll put you on the list to testify. It's a first-come, first-served basis, so if you were first on the list, you get to testify first. And the beauty of COVID, actually, is that Idaho transitioned to a virtual testimony system. So you could actually go online and testify via Zoom. You don't have to come into the Capitol every time if you just can't make it down here for that particular day. Also, if you can come down in person, you can also sign up to testify by coming right in the doors of the committee room, and then there's usually a sign-up sheet right there by the doors, and you'll write your name and whether or not you're for or against that legislation. So make sure that before you start your testimony that you state your name and state who you represent. If you're representing yourself and your personal views, make sure you say that you are representing yourself. That's just because you get so many lobbyists in this building and they're all representing different people. We want to know who you represent when you're testifying. Make sure you be concise. The longest testimony I've ever had to give was 5 minutes, but more often than not, you'll get a testimony of time of between 2 and 3 minutes. So you need to make sure that if you're making your points, you want to be on time. The committee chairman will stop you when they run out of time, and they have a lot of people to get to, so you want to make sure that you're on time there. Make sure that you address all questions through the chair. This can be a little unnatural for us because we tend to want to address the questions directly to the person who's asked us. So if this gentleman were to ask me a question, I can't just answer his question directly. I have to say, Mr. Chairman, Representative so-and-so, and then proceed with answering the question. This helps control the committee. The chair is in charge of the committee, but it also helps with the online viewers as well because they want to know who's talking. You may not be able to keep track if you're watching online or if you're just listening in. So this helps keep everything orderly. And finally, always make sure you're being respectful in your testimony and also as you're answering questions. Rather, a funny example, actually, it's funny now as we look back on it. The representative, you were president at the time. You were representing IFF at the time. Oh, okay. So Ron at the time was working for the Idaho Freedom Foundation. He was testifying on a piece of legislation in the Commerce Committee, and he was very respectful in his presentation, but he said something that the chairman did not like. And so the chairman actually had an Idaho State Trooper come and try to take him